switch on the record. So good evening, everybody. Welcome to the Citizens Forum lecture. Today's topic is Rammohun Roy's Enquiry into the Colonial Economy and its future implications. The talk will be delivered by Dr. Partha Pratim Basu, who received his PhD in political science from the University of Calcutta, which was published under the title Press and Foreign Policy in India. Presently, he is a professor of international relations at Jadavpur University and also an executive president, Jadavpur Association of International Relations. He has also served as a departmental chair, coordinator, Center for Advanced Studies, Department of International Relations, and the editor, Jadavpur Journal of International Relations, and the director, School of Media, Communication and Culture, Jadavpur University. He is also a recipient of the Fulbright Visiting Lecturer Award, under which he was attached to the Center for Asian Democracies, Louisville, Kentucky, between January and April 2014. He has a number of publications on various aspects of the thoughts of Raja Rammohun Roy, apart from contributing to book chapters on Raja's political thought. He published a monograph in 2008 titled Revisiting Rammohun Roy's Political Agenda, Implications for the Post-Colonial Indian Polity, under the aegis of Rammohun Roy Memorial Museum in 2020. In 2020, he edited a volume titled Rereading Rammohun Roy, a 21st Century Perspective, which was brought out by Serbian Kolkata. So with that, I will give the stage to Dr. Basu, who will be enlightening us today with his talk. Over to you, Dr. Basu.
Thank you so much, and good evening, everybody. As it has already been pointed out, that I'm going to talk about Raja Rammohun Roy's economic ideas. In fact, when we talk about Raja Rammohun Roy, we usually refer to various aspects of his thoughts and action. For example, we refer to his socio-political activities, religious reforms, his the way he took up the cause of women, his contribution to journalism in India. But comparatively speaking, his views on economics, on the Indian economy, his analysis of the colonial economy, this remains somewhat marginalized, less talked about. And yet, I would like to refer to the well-known economist, Professor Bhabatosh, who in one of his articles published in a volume called Rammohun Shoron, which came out in 1989, he basically argued that Rammohun Roy could also be regarded as a pioneer in the arena of the analysis of the colonial economy, as well as proffering some recommendations in this connection. And in fact, Dr. also argued that Rammohun Roy, based on his economic views, economic contributions to economic thought, could very well be regarded as he somewhat anticipated the economic drain thesis, later popularized by scholars like R.C. Dutt and Dadabhai Naoroji, which in fact became a major contribution towards Indian national movement in later years. Now, Rammohun Roy's economic ideas could be gleaned from different sources. For example, his various writings, publications in various newspapers, periodicals, his various speeches and pamphlets. But primarily, we have to rely on two sources, basically. On the one hand, there was the evidence he gave before the Select Committee of the House of Commons in 1831 during his sojourn in England. And in the next year, there was a series of notes published on the settlement of Europeans in India in 1832. In fact, he delivered a lecture on the similar topic a couple of years back, in fact, in 1829. But these two were the major resources. And if we go through these sources, we'll find that there were primarily two themes he sought to address as far as his economic ideas were concerned. On the one hand, there was a question of India's future economic development, India's course of economic development, and here he was basically, recommending following a liberal capitalist path, a liberal capitalist model of development. And the second theme was the reform of land relations prevalent in Bengal, prevalent in India. And this was, in fact, considered somewhat as a precondition, as a prerequisite to capitalist transition in India. Now, obviously, this unabashed advocacy of the capitalist model of development, obviously, rather predictably, it attracted quite stringent criticism. And so, in addition to dealing with these two aspects of his thought, we shall also deal with this criticism aspect as well. So to begin with his economic liberalism, it basically had two components. On the one hand, there was a strong pitch he made for free trade and end of the East India Company's economic monopoly over India trade. And secondly, there was a very strong call for opening up the Indian market to foreign capital and foreign entrepreneurship. And in fact, he called for removal of restrictions imposed under the East India Company regime upon European settlement in India, settlement of Europeans apart from the East India Company employees, settlement of these Europeans in Indians. And this was necessary, he felt, to promote the agenda of industrialization of India. Now, as far as the first argument is concerned, this is the first aspect is concerned, that is his free trade argument. I will be brief on this part, on this segment. Actually, this has to be viewed, his call for free trade, his advocacy of free trade has to be viewed in the context of the debate that was going on at that point of time, say in the early decades of the 19th century. Between the merchant capital on one hand, East India Company was the representative of this particular side of the debate, and on the other hand, there were the industrial capitalists, the voters of industrial capital, and who were in favor of trade liberalization with India. Now, Rammohun basically offered two kinds of arguments to support his case for free trade. On the one hand, he argued that East India Company's trade monopoly, it basically gave it a free hand to determine the nature, the quantum, or the commodities to be imported from abroad. And Rammohun felt that this ultimately amounted to a kind of plunder. What was called trade, it was ultimately reduced to a kind of plunder. On the other hand, if Indian trade was opened up, what were the benefits? Rammohun felt that it will immensely benefit the consumers. For example, it will increase competitiveness among the traders. It will lead to fall in prices, which would be the expected outcome of this growing competitiveness, growth in competitiveness. And of course, it would offer a wider choice to the consumers as far as the traded items were concerned. So his case for free trade was rested on these two kinds of arguments. But going beyond that, there was a further argument which also went against, or which also supported his case for free trade. That is export of if you look at the structure of the trade, the typical classical colonial pattern of trade, that is export of raw materials and import of finished products from England. Raw materials going out of India and finished products coming into India. Now, this ultimately, in his view, this crippled the prospects of industrialization of India. So this brings us to the second aspect, the second component of his liberal thought, as we have pointed out. That is the somewhat controversial proposition, some controversial proposal for European settlement in India. Now, if we begin with the rationale, the reasons behind why the East India Company, they imposed restrictions upon Europeans settling in India, doing business in India, of course, as we said, beyond its own functionaries and officials. Two, three reasons were offered. First of all, it was said that, well, the jobs that are done by the Indians and at a cheaper rate, if the Europeans come and do the same kind of job or compete for the same kind of job, it will push up the wages, push up, they will demand higher pay for that. So this is one reason. The second reason was that was offered by the East India Company, a second rationale was that it will lead to conflict of interest between the Europeans and the local people, the Indian native population. And particularly there was the, danger, there was the apprehension that the Europeans will be ill-treating the local population. So that would add an additional dimension to the issue. And thirdly, there was perhaps also an apprehension at the back of the minds of the East India Company rulers that the presence of such a huge number of European immigrants in India, this might create a kind of, this might cause kind of a revolution, kind of rising, which was akin to what happened in the United States, which ultimately led to the separation of the United States and emergence of the United States as a separate state. Now, how did Rammohun Roy combat these arguments, or what were his arguments in favor of his proposition that Europeans should be allowed, these restrictions should be removed, and Europeans in general should be allowed to come and settle in India? Now, the first and foremost argument was, as we already mentioned, that he felt that this would be a kind of impetus. This will create a kind of impetus to the industrialization project, to the project of industrialization in India. It will bring in, they will bring in new capital, they will bring in technology, they will bring in entrepreneurship. India will also benefit from their innovative spirit. So this was the most important argument on the part of, from Rammohun Roy, as far as the European settlement was concerned. Secondly, as far as the agricultural sector was concerned, in particular, Roy said that they will bring in, the Europeans will bring in new farming techniques. This will ultimately lead to crop diversity in India, and crop diversity ultimately mean that an economy which was focused primarily, an agriculture which was focused primarily on production of food crops, it will ultimately, it can ultimately experiment with commercial crops, cash crops. Thirdly, there was another controversial reference. Here, Rammohun Roy, while explaining the benefits of European settlement as far as the Indian agriculture was concerned, he made a reference to the indigo planters. Indigo planters, as we know that usually in Indian history, Indian mainstream history, they were regarded, they recorded Bellini as kind of role. So Rammohun's appreciation for this category of people also created a lot of controversy. We shall come back to that controversy later. But on the whole, Rammohun felt that taking both sides together, as far as the impact on industry and on Indian agriculture, there is a possibility that it will collectively lead to a kind of replication of the economic prosperity experienced by the Americas and bring immense benefits for the people of India. And we can also add one more point here, which Rammohun felt, which Rammohun offered in support of his case for European settlement. That is, European settlement will bring cultural and political benefits as well. Cultural benefits means that it will open doors for educational advancement in India. It will acquaint Indians with Western science, Western philosophy, Western literature. That would be another very important development. And on the other hand, as far as the political gains he had in mind, the argument was that interaction with the Europeans will ultimately create a kind of rights awareness, rights consciousness among the Indian people. And this will go a long way towards combating, towards curtailing the despotic kind of rule imposed by the East India Company on the Indians. But the final thing is that he did not really dismiss the possibility we have already mentioned earlier while discussing East India Company's, how the East India Company people explained the restrictions they imposed on European settlement. Roy did not dismiss really the possibility that the Europeans, since they belong to the superior, to the ruling race, and they will suffer from, they will be marked by a kind of superiority complex, and ultimately this will this will encourage them to injure the sentiment of the Indian people, to humiliate the Indian people, to treat them in a injurious way. Now, to put up safeguards against such possibilities, he actually suggested two safeguards here. Number one, he suggested that at least during the initial period, at least for 20 years, that was his suggestion, the restrictions will be withdrawn on European settlement, but there were conditions. It will be a conditional withdrawal. And what were the conditions? It will only the educated Europeans, to quote him, Europeans of character and capital, who were less likely to ill-treat the Indians, thanks to their cultural upbringing. It will be this category of people who will be allowed to come into India, settle in India, doing business in India. So there was the apprehension that there will be their interest will clash with that of the Indians, and they will hurt the feelings of the native population. That possibility will be minimized. And there was a second safeguard Rammohun suggested, that there will be one set of laws, one equal set of laws to be applied alike to all people, Europeans and Indians, irrespective of any caste barriers and racial barriers and religious barriers. So this was another very important point made by Rammohun Roy, that the functioning of a cabinet system that calls for a very strong legal infrastructure. So that suggestion was very much there. Now to come to the controversy part. Rammohun Roy's economic views, this came in for a very sharp criticism in the 1970s. It generated a very heated debate, particularly in the wake of the celebration of the bicentenary of Raja Rammohun Roy's birth in 1972. And the critics mainly fell into two categories. On the one hand, there were nationalist critics, nationalist historians, most importantly, Ramesh Chandra Majumdar, who delivered a lecture at the Asiatic Society of Kolkata. And this lecture was published in a book form. The lecture was titled On Rammohun. And a second set of critics, they belong to the leftist category. And a number of such analysis, a number of such critic of Rammohun Roy's views on modernization, they were contained in a book edited by V.C. Joshi. The book was titled Rammohun Roy and the Process of Modernization in India. Several left-leaning critics, including Ashok Sen, Borunde, Shumit Shorkar, they contributed to this volume. Now let us take brief note of the two positions. As far as the nationalist position was concerned, of course, Ramchandra Majumdar, the intellectual sweep of his critique was quite large, but a basic contention was, particularly as far as the nationalist position was concerned, the basic contention was that when you are under colonial rule, when you are under a colonial situation, the first and foremost responsibility, the first and foremost duty of a nationalist is to call for abolition of foreign rule, alien rule. Now, precisely Rammohun Roy failed on this count. He failed to give this kind of a call. In fact, his proposal to hobnob with the British as far as India's economic development was concerned, we have already referred to his proposal for European settlement in India. Now, all this puts his patriotic credentials under the scanner. So this was essentially the nationalist position. I'm not going to the details of the arguments. On the other hand, as far as the leftist position was concerned, this was more focused on his economic views, his economic vision. So that's why I'll be dealing with this aspect in some detail. First of all, they argued that when Rammohun Roy was very much active, both intellectually, politically, socially, and in other ways, in the early decades of the 19th century, or even earlier, but the last decades of the 18th century, when that was precisely the time when he was growing up. Now, this was a period when the vice grip of colonialism was getting consolidated in India. And we have to keep in mind that this was the darkest hour of deindustrialization in India. The indigenous industries, the traditional handicraft industries, they were being systematically decimated. And yet, under the same circumstances, during the same period, Rammohun Roy's his development agenda was he was weaving his development agenda around free trade on the one hand, free trade with the Europeans, and on the other hand, industrialization in India through collaboration with the Europeans. Now, their argument was that this was a naive position. This was naivety at the least and self-deception at the worst. Now, they contended that this makes it clear that Rammohun Roy had very little understanding of the very, apparently divergent roles, different roles the bourgeois class plays in their home countries, where the role is definitely progressive. And the kind of transition Rammohun was thinking of, definitely the bourgeoisie brought about the same kind of transition in their home countries, in the metropolis, colonial metropolis. But their role was definitely different, very strikingly different in the colonies, where their activities, their economic engagement ultimately gives rise to a kind of collaboration between the feudal forces and the capitalist forces, and ultimately it brings into being some kind of crippled capitalism, truncated capitalism. So what Rammohun was dreaming about, so it was ultimately it was likely to end up in this kind of truncated capitalism. And Thirdly, Rammohun Roy was also put in the dock for his appreciative references to the indigo planters. Now, if these were the major arguments that were offered by the leftist scholars, they I mean, wound up their arguments with reference to, I mean, how they would like to explain Rammohun Roy's views, his economic vision, economic proposal for the development of Indian economy. And they referred to Rammohun Roy's class background. That is, Rammohun Roy was a beneficiary of the colonial economic structure in various ways. For example, he owned huge lots of landed estates under the permanent settlement of Lord Cornwallis. He had his investments in the money lending business. He had very close association with the British agency houses and the free trading community of Kolkata. And all this explains why he exhibited this kind of a subservient attitude towards the colonial rule. So all these were very hard-hitting criticisms. Now, how do you respond? How do you respond to these criticisms these days? Now, in the beginning, we have to acknowledge that, well, definitely there were limitations to Rammohun Roy's understanding and analysis of the colonial economy. But at the same time, keeping that in mind, acknowledging that in the first place, let us put forward some arguments, some responses. First and foremost, we must mention, and it's no secret, that Rammohun Roy was no traditional conventional nationalist. But we understand by nationalist, Rammohun Roy was definitely not a nationalist in that sense. In fact, he was, as we know, he was a confirmed cosmopolitan. He's cosmopolitan in his outlook. And we have been referring to the book called Rammohun Shoron, which was edited by Pulin Bihari Sen and others. And this was a tribute to Rammohun Roy in the occasion of his bicentenary celebrations. Now, in the appendix of this book, there is a letter. And this letter Rammohun wrote to a French journalist with whom he was on very close terms, friendly terms, Victor Jacquemont. And here he very clearly explained his point of view in this connection. That, you see, my agenda is economic development of India. And in order to do that, you have to give a push. You have to give a very vital push to the stagnant Indian economy. And if the forces of change, they do not work from within the economy, within the country itself, then you have to depend on external forces, on external impetus. And that was precisely what Rammohun was suggesting when he was arguing that India should take advantage of European settlement in India in order to carry forward its development agenda, its development program. Secondly, there was a question of deindustrialization. We have seen that the leftists were arguing that during the 1820s and 1830s, actually India was experiencing kind of deindustrialization when Rammohun was actually expecting to advance India's industrialization program with the help of the Europeans. Now, it has been mentioned, in fact, it has been mentioned by Professor Rammohun Chakraborty in a very brilliant analysis of Rammohun Roy's, an overall assessment of Rammohun Roy way back in 1979. And we can also add the name of another scholar, Nirmal Bagchi. Rammohun Chakraborty argued that if this was a period of deindustrialization, it was also a period of reindustrialization. New industries are coming up, some of them under Indian leadership, under the leadership of the Indian entrepreneurs. For example, Dwarkanath Thakur, Rammohun Roy's close disciple, close friend and close disciple. He was one of the very important examples of these upcoming Indian entrepreneurs. And Nirmala Bagchi, in fact, presents a whole list. Once again, in the appendix of his book, he presents a whole list of the industries which did come up during this period. Different kinds of industries, different kinds of, but they were modern industries. And in any case, we know that reindustrialization calls for a kind of deindustrialization. The two cannot be segregated, cannot be separated. One entails the other. And therefore, if Rammohun would have thought that new manufacturing industries will come up on the ruins of the indigenous artisan industries, he could not really be faulted, perhaps, for expecting that. In fact, the kind of criticism that was coming from the scholars of the 20th century, one could very well argue that much of it was much of it was based on kind of hindsight. Uh, then if you come to the question of the indigo planters, another very controversial issue. Now, what kind of prospects Rammohun, or for that matter, Narottanath Thakur was also very, very, his speeches also contained references to the indigo planters, references which were full of admiration. Now, what kind of transformation, what kind of new possibilities they identified? First and foremost, we have already mentioned that the indigo planters brought capital and new machinery, application of new machinery in agriculture. This ultimately resulted in reclamation of fallow land, or when it comes to cultivable land, that was put to alternative kind of use, and it contributed towards agricultural expansion. Thirdly, there was a question of road construction, development of other kinds of communication facilities. In fact, what we call these days infrastructural development, that was also one of the consequences of the indigo planters' intervention in the agricultural economy of India at that time. Fourthly, and this was important, Narottanath Thakur pointed out that the indigo planters, their activities, their engagement in Indian agriculture, it gave birth to a kind of new production relations. In fact, feudal obligation-based production relations. It promised to give way to bourgeois contract-oriented production relations, and this ultimately added variety. It provided a new direction to the Indian agriculture, Bengali agriculture, and as we have mentioned already, that the promise was to transform a food crop oriented economy, an economy which is primarily geared towards producing food crops. There was a possibility of this kind of economy getting transformed into cash crop oriented economy. If not cash crop oriented, really, the possibilities of producing cash crops was created, and there was also the possibility of connecting Indian economy towards with the global market. Of course, Rammohun Roy was very much aware about the downside of indigo cultivation. He was very much aware about the kind of operation the indigo cultivators brought down upon the Indian peasants. Of course, once again, we can refer back to Professor Bhavatosh Sotta, who argued specifically that when you talk about the operation of the indigo cultivators, actually it rose to its height in the 1850s, which ultimately led to the Indigo Revolution, because it was around this time that production of indigo, the price of indigo in the international market, it declined, and which ultimately was responsible for the kind of torture and tormentation the indigo cultivators ultimately heaped upon the Indian peasants. But Rammohun Roy was writing in the 1820s and 1830s, and Dotto argues that Rammohun Roy did not really witness the worst of the kind of oppression the indigo cultivators imposed upon the Indian peasants. But Rammohun made a very interesting argument here. He argued that you are talking about repression by the indigo cultivators. And yes, they are foreigners. That adds a new dimension to the issue. But what about the homegrown zamindars? What about the zamindars? What about their torture? What about their repression? What about their tormentation of the Indian peasants? And in fact, he pointed out that the indigo cultivators, their rise in agriculture, Bengali agriculture, it basically gave rise to the prospect of dual power structure in the countryside. That is the oppression of the zamindars. They are unbridled oppression. They are unbridled power. They are unbridled authority over the countryside. That would be kind of, counteracted by the rise of the indigo cultivators as a power as a force to reckon with. Now, this brings me to the last part of my discussion. Actually, I've tried to respond to the arguments raised by the critics, but there is one more thing. That is the question of Rammohun Roy's, the allusion to Rammohun Roy's class background. Now, we have seen that there was an argument, there was a premise that the kind of suggestions Rammohun offered for India's economic development, which accorded a very important role to the foreign players. Now, this could very much be traced to his class background. Now, I would like to make two responses here. Number one, this kind of determinism that the thoughts and action of a particular person is influenced, if not determined, by his or her class position. And this kind of determinism has been discarded even by, I think, all variants of Marxists. In fact, many Marxist scholars called it a kind of Namierism, which they propose to discard. But on the other hand, the more important point is that Rammohun Roy, despite his class affiliation, we cannot rule out his class affiliation. We cannot say that he was never swayed by his class interests. But at the same time, he had the capacity, he had the vision, he had the resilience to rise above his class constraints. And this brings us to the other theme in his economic vision, that is his views on permanent settlement, the question of land reform of the land relations, and the plight of the Indian peasantry, which in fact necessitated the call for the reform of land relations. Now, as we know that under permanent settlement between the East India Company on the one hand and the new breed of zamindars on the other hand, zamindar was given the role of the revenue collector, and he was supposed to collect revenue from the peasants and hand it over to the government. Now, the most important thing was, the beauty of the system was the rate of revenue payable by the zamindars to the government. This was permanently fixed. This was fixed once and for all. That is the heart of permanent settlement. And the objective was very clear. In fact, the objects were twofold. On the one hand, it was supposed to give a kind of incentive to the zamindars so that they can invest more in the land. They get more interested in enhancing production. And on the other hand, of course, there was a political motive that this class will be politically indebted to the British rulers. They will be a loyal class. Their support will be guaranteed. But if you come to the other side of the picture, as far as the riots was concerned, as far as the tillers, the cultivators were concerned, we also know that the zamindars passed on much of their obligations to the riots. and they used all the kinds of tricks in their books in order to achieve that objective. Moreover, over and above the legal dues they are supposed to collect and pass on to the government, they imposed various other dues. They were called abwabs, and other kinds of names were popular there. So these were collected in the name of various, suppose various occasions, religious occasions, and marriage of the zamindars, family members, and this was made possible by the loopholes in the permanent settlement. That is, it was clearly tilted. It was clearly tilted towards the zamindars, and the while the interest of the zamindars were protected in a foolproof manner, the rights of the ryots remained very much vulnerable. Now, what was Rammohun Roy's take on this question? Rammohun Roy, as we know, he was a beneficiary of the permanent settlement. But because of that, he was very much conversant. He was very much familiar with this grim reality. And when he was giving evidence before the House of Commons' Select Committee in the 1830s, early 1830s, he exposed these facts, these stark facts, in a very blunt manner. He very flatly stated, in response to the questions he was asked there, that this new system, the system of permanent settlement, it has actually improved the conditions of the zamindars, the proprietors of land, but it had not taken care of the interest of the cultivators. Their conditions have only deteriorated under the new dispensation. And that is why he also pointed out a very interesting point. He meant that the cultivators, they had very little incentive to enhance production, because for them, more production will mean greater dues and greater operation for extracting those dues. So what was Rammohun's suggestion? What was Rammohun's resolution? The basic point was that he called for a new settlement that will take care of the interest not only of the government and the zamindars, as it was already being done, but a new settlement will benefit the third party, the peasant cultivator as well. It had to ensure that the cultivator should have a reasonable share of the income generated from economic produce. In fact, Rammohun made several specific proposals here. He said that their dues need to be lowered because they were already very high. He said that the zamindars will have no powers. They will be deprived of, they will be dispossessed of all powers to impose the new kind of impositions, to make the new kind of impositions in the name of various, on various excuses. And finally, that's another very interesting point, and this continued even in the post-independence period. This remained a very important issue in the land reform agenda. That is, a record of the tenants will have to be prepared, and they will have to be given Partha, that is, land rights. So these suggestions, if accepted, they would have amounted to a kind of makeover of the entire permanent settlement. The entire permanent settlement framework. But there were two other suggestions. Once again, very intriguing suggestions. On the one hand, he said that, well, the kind of proposals you have made, this might have led to lowering of decline in government earnings from revenues. So this loss could very well be made up for by taxing luxury items. So basically, he was arguing that on the one hand, you will have to spare the peasant, the marginalized. On the other hand, you will have to impose taxes upon the rich. And Rammohun Roy himself belonged to this rich category. And yet, somewhat going against his class interests, he was actually proposing imposition of taxes upon his own category of people. And secondly, there was the question of restricting government expenditure. Restricting government expenditure. That was the other side of the coin, in fact. And here his proposal was that instead of Europeans for managing the revenue establishment, you employ Indians, because once again you will have that will enable you to bring down your establishment costs. Uh, and finally, in this connection, as I mentioned at the very beginning of my talk, that Bhabatosh Tattva referred to Rammohun as the pioneer, as the earliest thinker who referred to the economic drain thesis. That is a huge lot of Indian wealth that was being drained out to England on various pretexts under British rule. Actually, he drew on the reports of the Auditor General and the Accountants General, and he argued that between 50 to 60 lakh pounds, 50 to 60 lakh pounds are being siphoned off in the name of, well, on various kinds of charges, home charges, salaries and pensions of its employees, East India Company employees, interest on loans raised in England, and so on. So all these things he brought to the notice, brought to the attention of the members of the House of Commons Select Committee. Of course, Paudosotto points out that the way he calculated the amounts, the amount of drain, that had its limitations once again, and but at the same time, we have to we have to maintain that if we keep in view that Rammohun Roy was no trained economist, and there was also the question of data constraints. It was a remarkable achievement. It was a remarkable achievement, and in fact, the kind of drain thesis that was put forward by R.C. Dutt and Dadabhai Naoroji in the late 19th century, which became a very important staple for the leaders of the national movement to attack the British. Now, Rammohun Roy's analysis contained this thesis in its basic seeds, and Dr. somewhat regrets that Rammohun Roy was not really this contribution was not really acknowledged by his successors. Anyway, I am now at the end of my talk, and I would conclude with a reference to Professor Partha Chatterjee's article, Abar Rammohun. It was an article published in 2011 in the Baromash magazine, a Bengali magazine. Rammohun again, or revisiting Rammohun, if you like. That was the title. Now, he argues that the basic problem with the earlier assessments of Rammohun Roy was that he was treated as a nationalist leader. Now, Chatterjee argues that Rammohun Roy actually belonged to a different era, a different historical period, which could not be directly linked up with the nationalist phase of the Indian history. The two could not be treated in terms of a continuum. Chatterjee concludes that, well, Rammohun was no nationalist, but that does not mean that he was necessarily a colonial collaborator, which was basically the some of his critics were suggesting. Rather, Chatterjee argues that Rammohun belonged to a Kolkata-centric civil society, a Calcutta-centric civil society of the early decades of the 19th century. And the leading lights of this civil society of which Rammohun and Narokaran Thakur were definitely two luminaries, but there were others as well. Their main agenda was, as we have pointed out, opposition to the East India Company's monopoly of India trade and their clamor for freeing up India trade. Then there was the emphasis on civil rights. We have mentioned his reference. We have talked about his reference to rights consciousness, generation of rights consciousness that was supposed to follow European settlement in India. And of course, there was a question of European settlement. Now, this liberal capitalist vision was modeled upon the developments of the Americas. Sometimes it was the United States, sometimes it was Canada, sometimes it was some republics of Southern America. Now, Chatterjee argues that this was no daydreaming. This was no daydreaming. Actually, if the civil societies of Boston, Massachusetts, Philadelphia, if they could have attained this goals, they could have attained this approach this vision. Why not the Calcutta civil society, Calcutta-centric civil society of which Rammohun was a member. Now, I would like to conclude with Partha Chatterjee's comments because Chatterjee, very interestingly, he confesses in this article that in the 1970s, he was very much supportive of the contentions of the leftist critics. But now he feels, after, attaining maturity, that the case of Rammohun Roy needs to be revisited. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Dr. Basu. Thank you for that extremely illuminating talk on Rammohun, and especially the way you have gone through the economic reforms and the Rammohun's views on the current situation and how he involved the current society in that. So may I now request the audience, if you have any questions, could you please unmute yourselves and pose a question to Dr. Basu? So if you do have any questions, please feel free to unmute yourself and post a question to Dr. Basu. We do not seem to have anyone asking a question. Then may I request Jyoti Gupta to kindly declare the vote of thanks?
Yes, I'll offer the vote of thanks, but in case, there are any questions on the chat box in the meantime, perhaps, we can take it up after that.
Right, there is nothing in the chat box.
Okay. Actually, we know so little about Rammohun and his economic thoughts that at least for me, it was, an eye-opener, because we do hear a lot about his social reform, his religious reform, about women's education, about sati. We have also had short references to his politics, but about his economic thoughts, I think we have never gone into depth. So thank you very much, Professor Basu, for this extremely well analyzed and in-depth talk on Rammohun's economic ideas. And what was most interesting is that you have been able to talk of the ways in which Rammohun's economic ideas as being pro-British, pro-colonizer, had been at one point of time in the 1970s to 1980s. It had been, criticized, and Rammohun was treated as a non-patriotic man or non-patriotic leader. But contextualizing him and talking of his ideas about the indigo planters, the idea of this re-industrialization, as you were talking about free trade, about the way in which the riots were, you can say, exploited by the zamindars more than anything else, not directly perhaps by the permanent settlement and the policy of the permanent settlement. These are extremely important cues to dealing with Rammohun or dealing with the criticism about Rammohun's economic ideas and economic thoughts. So, from the bicentenary, that was the time when the leftist critics had taken up cudgels against Rammohun. We are now in the 250th year. And what you mentioned last by quoting from Partha Chatterjee's views, it seems important to reassess Rammohun's economic thoughts, the sources of which you have gone to, but very few of us have actually, looked at those sources or, considered those sources. So while there were limitations, as you suggested, it's the intention of Rammohun which becomes much more important. And that intention was more idealistic, maybe not entirely practical, but, this is something new that we have learned. So thank you very much, Professor Partha Pratim Basu, for this excellent, talk on Rammohun's economic thought. We would like to, though the audience has been, very small this time, this is a time when maybe people have not been able to join, but this has been recorded and it will be put up. Those who have been able to make it, thank you very much for that. I would like to thank Mr. Amit Dash for his cooperation and his introduction to the program, and to everyone else who has been so supportive. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Joytidi. Thank you for those words. So it seems we have no questions. So thank you once again, Dr. Basu, for your most illuminating talk. And thank you to the audience who have joined in and been so patient for this hour, listening to Professor Basu. We will be informing you about the next episode of our lectures in due course. Till then, thank you. Stay safe. Goodbye.
Bye.
Thank you. Thank you.